Hello and welcome to the Ukrainian Toronto Television. My name is Mark Kaplan and my co-host is Melania Podolyak. And our guest today is Michael Weiss, a famous American investigative journalist who covered wars in Syria and now covers Russian war in Ukraine. He's an author of a best-selling book, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, and is probably, in my opinion, one of the best journalists covering Russian war in Ukraine right now.
We have heard a lot about Ukrainian Nazis and kind of this omnipresent boogeyman, and Russian propaganda has invested heavily in this myth, which has been happily adopted by a lot of people in the West. However, it is possible that actual Nazism/fascism is kind of on the other side of the border. And for those who are more familiar with Russia, it's not a secret that the part of their national government ideology is there's, hatred is this ideology, and this is their nation building material. Why does no one ever didn't talk about far right in Russia before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, before all this material came out? Why was nobody paying attention?
Well, I think, we are still, unfortunately, dealing with not just years, but decades of assimilated Russian propaganda and disinformation. And our very way of understanding Russia's military capability, which many people in the Western analytic community got absolutely wrong, right? Kyiv was going to fall in 3 days. Russia is probably their most strategically adroit mission, and where they've had the greatest accomplishments is convincing their enemy that they are something that they simply are not, right? So when Russia comes out and says there is a Nazi junta that has taken control in Kyiv in 2014, and they're using organizations like the Night Wolves, which is a very nationalistic, if not fascistic, biker gang to do sort of this weird roadshow pageantry in occupied Crimea. When they're relying, I have a report that I've co-written with Pierre Vau, who is my colleague at The Interpreter, and he's a brilliant analyst and, scholar, essentially, of the European far right. And the report's called Dark War, How Russian Fascists Spearheaded the Invasion of Ukraine. And what we try to demonstrate, and I think this is the first time it's ever been put in one place, is that the plan for this war of occupation, really war of conquest, doesn't even begin in 2014. If you go back to the early 1990s, right, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this weird sort of phenomenon is taking shape. The KGB, the Soviet, now Russian security services, had co-opted ultra-nationalists, anti-Semites, weird sort of religious cultists and monarchists, meaning people who still believed in the Tsar. And they used them as a kind of bulwark against what was seen as a more credible liberal opposition internally. But then a weird thing happened. A lot of the guys within these movements ended up joining the Russian security services. And more to the point, they cut their teeth in a lot of the conflicts, separatist, quote unquote, wars that broke out as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in this report, for instance, we spent a lot of time looking at three characters. Alexander Borodai, the so-called prime minister of the People's Republic of Donetsk. Igor Girkin, the famous war criminal who has been convicted in absentia in the Netherlands for his role in downing MH17. And Olya Kalugina, who is somebody who turns up on the battlefield in various different capacities. One time she's an academic, the next time she's a medic, but she's carrying an assault rifle very expertly. And she's, by all outward appearances, GRU, Russian military intelligence. And these three characters are very interesting because they all sort of knew each other beginning in the 90s. Girkin, Borodai, and Kalugina all fought in Moldova over Transnistria. Yeah, Girkin famously was also...
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So it's like a reunion.
It's a reunion. And more than that, they all swam in the same kind of weird, what was seen at the time to be fringe far-right currents. Borodai and Girkin both contributed to Zavtra, which was a deeply anti-Semitic far-right publication, the ultra-nationalist project in Russia. Borodai's father had been involved with Alexander Dugin, who I know in the West is sort of played up and caricatured as Putin's brain. He's not that, but nor is he someone that can be easily dismissed either. He has had a marked impact and influence, certainly within the Russian special services and the way that a lot of the war planners, I think, for the first invasion of Ukraine, conceived of things. So
if you like this video and want as many people as possible to see it, you can help. You can like our video, you can subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below so that YouTube would promote this content to as many people as possible, and it would be really helpful, and we would be really, really grateful. Also, we would be grateful if you consider donating to our cause, right? With Buy Me a Coffee website. Thank you very much.
I mean, one of the things that binds this whole conflict, at least to my mind, on the Russian side is it is a revanchist imperial project, right? It is looking to reconstitute as much of, not really even the Soviet Union, but the great Russian Empire of yore. It is driven by deeply illiberal, if not openly fascistic, ideologies. These guys, they don't like the Jews, right? They believe that all of Europe is sort of a degenerate liberal project. I mean, Girkin is now being called out for his anti-Semitism by Solovyev, the leading Russian state propagandist. And yeah, it's something that has sort of fallen by the wayside in terms of how, particularly the Western press, I think, has tried to anatomize the Russian project here. Now, this isn't to take away agency from Putin. It's not to take away agency from Shoigu and Gerasimov and the sort of more conventional military aspects. But if you want to look at the tip of the spear, as it were, all of these actors, all mobbed up variously with the security services. Borodai had claimed for years, boasted of his relationship with the FSB. They all wind up in very senior positions, in commanding positions in the so-called separatist, insurgency that takes place in 2014 in Donbass. And for better or for worse, for Ukraine's purposes, they had left their imprint on what is now still the LDNR occupied territories in the east, and at least laid the groundwork for what was going to be this full-scale war of conquest and occupation. And now, what else do we see? And this, again, going back 10 years, the advent of the Russian imperial movement. I mean, nakedly neo-Nazi in orientation, right? Rusich, my God, the war crimes, the savagery, the atrocities committed, burning Ukrainian soldiers alive. We actually today noticed that Graham Phillips, the British propagandist, who's been sanctioned, he's now come back on Twitter. And one of the things that people are mentioning about him and his activities, nefarious though they were in 2014, 2015, he interviewed a blind POW. Graham Phillips did a lot worse than that. He interrogated on camera one of the victims of Rusich, the guy who was fucking burnt alive. And then literally they mutilated this guy, removed his organs from his corpse, and then stuffed them back in. This was the remains of a Ukrainian soldier that had been returned by this openly neo-Nazi organization. And guess what? These organizations, they have paramilitary training facilities inside Russian Federation territory. They are now sanctioned by various governments, including my own. They go around Europe connecting with elements of the European far right, particularly in Scandinavia, but elsewhere as well. And they are completely indulged, if not backed, by conventional Russian military assets and resources. So when Putin comes out and says, we are going to Ukraine to denazify Ukraine, physician, heal thyself. I mean, you've got a serious problem internally inside Russia with this. I do think that by and large...
Not a problem, though. Kind of a solution, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's no secret, right? Like, there's a weird... Hannah Arendt had an essay after World War II called The Fascist International, right? Sort of a play on the Communist International. Mm-hmm. But this is something I think that's a real phenomenon that's taken root in the 21st century. Russia has this weird sort of liquid or hodgepodge ability to fuse various different ideologies, right? So there's the exaltation of the KGB and the Cheka, right? The sword and the shield of Russia's security. Fortress Russia has been reconstituted under Putin. Then there is this sort of weird czarist Christianist, anti-Semitic element of, the revanchist Russian Empire that harkens back to the 19th century. And then, you have elements of Soviet, Leninist, Stalinist iconography, right? I mean, look at some of the statutes or the pop-up criminal proceedings that took place in Donbass under Girkin's and Borodai's administration. I mean, literally, Stalinist laws from 1952 or whatever. I mean, this is how they were putting people to the sword in the East. So, I mean, it's a strange thing. And look, I was saying to you guys before we started recording, everybody has now become a specialist on the Wagner group, right? Like, this is the new minted expertise. Everybody has to have an opinion about Prigozhin and where he stands with respect to MOD and what is Wagner. But how can anyone treat with Wagner and write articles about Wagner, which doesn't even affect only Ukraine, right? These guys are in Syria, Central African Republic, Mozambique, Libya. There's hardly a conflict zone in the world that Wagner hasn't been deployed to. How do you treat with this organization without noting the following? One, it's called Wagner because that's Adolf Hitler's favorite composer, as Dmitry Utkin, himself former GRU Spetsnaz officer, and himself also covered in fucking Nazi tattoos, has noted repeatedly. And B, based on the reading or the literature and stuff that has been recovered from tablets and electronic devices of Wagner operatives in the field, including one investigation done by BBC, these guys are completely drenched in far-right ideology and sense.
You say that it's not like, maybe I'm blind by this time when I read all those reports, but you say that when Western media report on Wagner, they don't mention usually that this is a neo-Nazi organization, right?
Yeah, it's very hard to find references to the provenance of it, and again, the symbolism of it. I mean, the very name is an allusion to neo-Nazism. But again, I think part of the problem is, we don't really know. You can't sit down and do interviews with Wagner the way that you can, for instance, do interviews with members of the Azov regiment, right?
Yeah, see, I wanted to say, but so it's very easy, right? It takes no time for a, undereducated journalist from the West to call Azov regiment Nazis. Correct. It doesn't take any time to even think about that. However, calling some, be it a Russian paramilitary group or be it Russian government or be it certain Russian politicians, that always takes time. Should we reference them as Nazis? How did that happen? Why is that a thing?
Yeah, it's weird.
Well, look, I think a couple things have happened. Number one, as I said, in the West, this instinct to have a kind of both sides appraisal of any news story, which is grounded in a sense of fair play and critical mindedness and natural skepticism of what, vested parties in any conflict or any issue have to say, has tended into, I think, more of a tendentious area, which is to say that, again, Russia has thrown enormous resources into information operations. And they did this even before the insurgency in 2014, even before the occupation of Crimea. And it's hard sometimes not to allow that to kind of get into the bloodstream. And reporters at mainstream news organizations feel duty bound to sort of dig into, let's be honest, there is a Nazi issue in Ukraine, like there's a Nazi issue in every fucking country in Europe. But,
there's an issue, there are actual Nazis in European parliaments,
Correct.
But that somehow is not as big of a problem as a couple of fringe groups of people in Ukraine. There are as many of those everywhere. But somehow that has been this kind of the main talking point for many representatives of many different media in the West.
Yeah, and
I'm kind of,
There's also, every time an article about Azov or Pravdy Sector or, now, RDK, right? The paramilitary group that's, I think, still engaged in combat in Belgorod, which is seen to be largely a product or a proxy of GUR. You just need to look at what the commanders of this organization have had to say on social media. These are not nice guys. They are Nazis. They have far-right ideology. But again, when you start to report on these things at the expense of putting it into context, right? I mean, I remember at the start in January, February of 2022, everybody was obsessed with this idea of, okay, so Putin says he's fighting fascism, that this is just another replay of World War II, right? Because this taps into the Russian national mythology of the Great Patriotic War, and this is a continuation of the struggle that we were all raised to understand well, and our grandparents told us this, and we still have the invisible regiment, is it called, or so.
Or as we in Ukraine call them, grandpas on sticks.
Grandpas on sticks, right?
Because they carry it on the stick.
But to examine all of that, and fine. I mean, I have no problem if people want to conduct academic or journalistic studies of Ukraine's far right problem. I mean, I have no problem when they do it about America's far right problem in our own armed forces, right? Which is increasingly quite dire. However, put it into its context, right? Ukrainian armed forces, if you take it in a full totality, not just, deployed, you're talking about over 1 million people, right? I mean, what is the percentage of those fighting on Ukraine's behalf right now who subscribe to any of this stuff in comparison with, as I mentioned earlier, look who is kind of forming the vanguard within the Russian ranks. Look who has been not co-opted, but created whole cloth or seconded as plausibly deniable mercenary forces or paramilitary proxies on the Russian side. A lot of Nazis, a lot of fascists. And I don't even pretend to be a scholar of Wagner and these other groups, but I will say, if you're looking to try and, go pound for pound here, the Russian problem, and this, by the way, isn't even a fringe, or you don't have to get into various different small organizations. The entire Z project, which is the Putinist project, and now the Russian state project, is a fascist enterprise. Right down to the pageantry, the iconography, the
things the Russian officials say and Russian propaganda say.
Absolutely.
That's a part of the theme I wanted to ask, and we'll talk about the journalists and NGOs again who were stationed in Russia, who were writing. Lots of them were writing articles about Ukraine. So they were writing articles about how Ukraine, the church is closed in Ukraine, they were writing articles about how Russian language were forbidden in Ukraine, etc., etc. But they never noticed the whole structure of Russian society, the whole culture, and how was it built, that it was fascist in its core, and how Ukrainian language was forbidden in Russia, essentially. No Ukrainian schools. People were killed trying to create Ukrainian cultural centers.
There's this underreported, completely overlooked story of a family who lived in Tula. Their names were Volodymyr Senishin, and his wife, her name was Kovalyova, and Natalia Kovalyova, and Volodymyr Senishin. What happened to them was they made this Ukrainian center in Tula, which meant just hanging out together. There was this a library with Ukrainian books, and you could come there and watch, Ukrainian soccer or whatnot. And it wasn't even intimidating. It wasn't even like a center for, developing Ukrainian something Russian. It was just like a community space. And what happened was they got murdered, brutally murdered, both of them in the street. And nobody ever looked into it. Nobody ever reported on it. Nobody even knows about this story. And I get this question a lot. People ask me before the 22nd of February 2022, 24th February, sorry. People ask me, well, how many schools, Russian schools, are there in Ukraine? How many, Russian cultural centers are there in Ukraine, given that there's so much Russian population in Ukraine? And I always ask them, how many do you think are there Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian libraries, and Ukrainian centers in Russia, given huge Ukrainian population in Russia? The answer is 0. Nobody ever reported on that. Nobody ever wrote about it. And yet somehow it's always the Russian language that's being endangered, even though there's a country of 144 million people who speak it, and there's no way in hell it's going to get, extinct or something, right? How is it that, this is the angle everybody's taking? How is it that, it grows very well into this Ukraine provoked Russia story because,
The very notion that Ukraine has a history and a culture and a sense of peoplehood completely distinct from Russia's is itself almost a revolutionary concept to so many, right? Even those who are well-meaning in the West, who sympathize with a vulnerable, victimized country that's been invaded for no reason. Oh, well, aren't they part of Russia? Like, what's going on? Crimea was given back, but it belongs to Russia, etc. And, it's taken some real pathfinding scholarship by Timothy Snyder, Sergei Plokhy, and others to kind of revivify what was lost in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, in my book, spent a lot of time investigating the Soviet-Polish War, where Ukraine was sort of caught up in the middle, if you like, and Ukrainian nationhood was being born at around that time, a little bit before, but then was completely extinguished. Recovering this sort of lost patrimony is, I think, a part of the project here. This isn't just a war for survival; it's a war for pride. Yeah, and this is I am hopeful that when all is said and done and Russia is strategically defeated, that Ukraine becomes its own country, defined not in relation to Russia, meaning not as the victim, not as the defender nation, but as its own phenomenon. And, one of the things, frankly, I've been suggesting in my journalism is that even more than NATO membership, I mean, you've already done single-handedly that which NATO was founded to do collectively, which is defeat the Russian army. EU membership and becoming part of Europe, in the conventional sense of Europe whole and free, I think that is going to be the definitive moment for Ukraine in so many respects, in terms of the cross-pollination of people's culture, but also you will have staked your own independence. It will be the culmination, I think the end game of a process that didn't really begin in 1989, 1991, but began, centuries ago. It's been a painful discovery. But the thing that impresses me the most about what Ukraine has achieved, we talk about some of these myths and we talk about these tropes of propaganda that all of us, including myself, by the way, and I've never been an admirer of Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin or any Russian government for that matter, but we have assimilated so much nonsense over the course of decades, right? Going back to even the pre-Cold War period, but certainly in the Cold War period. Ukraine is not just smashing Russian tanks and liberating settlements in Zaporizhzhia. It's dismantling Russian myths one by one by one by one. And that is a huge virtue, not just for your own country, but for the rest of us, because you have become a tutor to the West and to the United States. The U.S. says, well, you can't do this. And then you go and do it. And they say, oh, dobre, but you can't do the following. And then you go and do that. And they say, oh, well, okay, a miracle of miracles. You managed to do that too. But this is the final thing that we say you cannot do. Well, if you do that, then what's left to argue about, right?
And
when you say it, it sounds nice. But then this job of Ukraine dismantling this Russian mythology, propaganda and whatnot, it is somehow still, because when we talk especially about certain, gains that Ukraine has been making on battlefield, everybody seems to be very eager to report the amount of Western aid that was lost, but is not eager to report the things you've said about. That's what makes it weird.
I've been in American journalism for a very long time, both print, online, and broadcast, right? And one of the things that becomes a problem is there's an inbuilt sense of sensationalism, right? So, for instance, day 1, 2, 3 of a much heralded and much anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive. And, oh my God, here's a video of 2 Leopard tanks getting smashed and 5, 6 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles going up in smoke. And it's a calamity. It's a disaster. The counteroffensive is lost. Ukraine must cut a deal, blah, 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 blah. And what happens is, one media outlet picks up a story like that for clicks, right? Because it generates attention. It's an event and people are titillated, particularly in war. Then other media outlets say, well, we need a piece of that action. So the editors start charging, usually young, not very well-versed journalists who need to make a living and haven't ever been to Ukraine, for instance, much less reported from the front lines. And, they start typing away. And all of a sudden, it goes on the Drudge Report. Ukraine loses armor. Day 3 of counteroffensive. Questions are asked. Is this going to, everybody gets, hot under the collar. And I guess the only plus side of that is because there's such an appetite and also a willingness to furnish just this raw bullshit content, it's not going to last for very long. Like already the narrative has shifted away from destroyed Russian armor to liberation of 4 or 5 settlements and counting in southern Ukraine. Something big on the horizon. Budanov memes about him doing a video of silence for 30 seconds. So, yes, unfortunately, you are both the beneficiary, but also the victim of our own attention deficit disorder in the press. And also, frankly, just there's a lot of things that get reported that I think are stupid to report and stupid to report for the simple fact that people will seize on them and blow them up into this great sort of emblematic thing when it's yesterday's news already. You know what I mean?
Does it have me and Melania, we both engage with bad journalists, bad journalism from the West, especially all the time. We write these threads. We our S's are on fire 24/7.
24/7.
Yeah, but to what extent all this reporting, Ukrainian reaction, and all the stuff, Tucker Carlson's, for God's sake, to what extent they do have this effect on American public and second on American government? How
let's go through.
Aren't we in the bubble? In this sense,
Let's separate Tucker Carlson for a minute from. Maybe we have different definitions of bad reporting. So I know that Ukrainian Twitter, and believe me, I make almost every allowance for a population under siege, right? If you're facing genocide, I'm sorry, you're going to get a little emotional and you're going to be reactive to things that you feel is jeopardizing the defense of your country and your own survivability, right?
Yeah.
So I don't condemn Ukrainian Twitter for things that maybe other people
for being ridiculously toxic.
Yes, and also there's a lot of fucking virtue signaling and moral grandstanding and all of this shit. And I just, unfortunately, a lot of people who have become self-appointed experts and commentators on Ukraine live on Twitter. They don't have much else. And so they need to weigh in on everything and they need to pick these fights because it's A, titillating, and B, more importantly for them, it gets them followers, right? Again, real journalism is about prioritization. What's the story? And not only what is the story today, but can you anticipate what the story tomorrow is going to be? So, there are journalists though who do excellent work. And sometimes excellent work means telling uncomfortable facts or uncomfortable truths or doing things that don't conform to the narrative. So, I've seen good reporters at the New York Times, for instance, report on the use of cluster munitions in Ukraine. And this causes a big headache and ruckus. I mean, look, I'm somebody who you're not going to find a more sympathetic journalist toward Ukraine in American media than myself, right? I mean, I'm very opinionated on Twitter. I say I'm an investigative reporter, but I'm also kind of a pundit commentator, and I'm also a war reporter now. But I'm not going to pretend that I'm neutral as to what's going on. But, I'm also very interested in the kinds of weapons that have been delivered to Ukraine, both overtly and covertly. And I don't think it's bad reporting to say, hey, Ukraine's using something that the international community has banned for X, Y, and Z reasons. Is that going to really fundamentally alter the sympathy for Ukraine? No. Ukrainians can do dodgy things, questionable things, bad things, and it can still be a cause worth supporting and defending. So I don't have quite the hair trigger. So I don't like it when those journalists come under attack for doing their job. However, when you talk about somebody like Tucker Carlson, that is not a journalist. Okay,
Yeah, no, sure.
there's a special subspecies of abnormal psychology that could be dedicated to people who apply for jobs at the CIA and get rejected for various reasons.
Oh,
Did
really?
he? Did he really?
Oh yes, oh yes. And for whatever reason, Tucker Carlson realized he could never make it as a mainstream talking head on television. Everything he did got canceled. Firing Line, famously by Jon Stewart, a show on MSNBC, went nowhere. So he reinvents himself as a guy who's going to lean into all of the toxicity and the pathological race hatred and essentially what passes for fascistic ideology in America, because it's good for business. It generates views, old crotchety white guys sitting in the nursing home who think the country has gone to the dogs. They don't like the influx of immigrants, whether legal or not. They don't like the diversification in America. They don't like LGBT rights. They don't like X, Y, and for that reason, might think that Vladimir Putin has been wrongly vilified by the American mainstream media. Tucker Carlson is here to say, not only that, but Bashar al-Assad didn't use chemical weapons. He's fighting terrorists. We should support him. The Kakhovka Dam, well, clearly the Ukrainians did it. Well, hang on a minute. Even if you don't support Ukraine, even if you don't like Zelensky, speaking of pathological race hatred, what did he say? He has a rat-like, sweaty...
Yeah.
The only Jewish president in Europe has a rat-like sweaty face, and you've also described him in the past as a kind of a welfare queen, and just anti-Semitic tropes. And now he's completely uncorked because he has no institution backing him. He's just a guy on Twitter with a massive following. That's not journalism. That's propaganda, and that's, for whatever reason, people are asking, is he on the payroll of Putin? And all, you don't even have to overthink it. That's just somebody who is fueled by a deep-seated resentment. And it's somebody who, oddly, paradoxically, has made it by every definition. He's super rich. He's super famous. He has the command and influence over millions upon millions of voters in this country. And yet, he still feels like the world has done him innumerable disfavor, right?
Michael, are you saying Tucker Carlson has daddy issues?
He's got way worse than daddy issues. There's a whole species in American politics right now. Tom Nichols at The Atlantic, who's an old friend of mine, he writes about this well. I think Tom kind of undersells what could very well pass as textbook fascism. But in terms of the kind of ressentiment, the cultural aspects of, changing demography in America leads to, what starts out maybe as a kind of irascibility, but then grades into almost violent hatred of your compatriots. Tucker has turned that into a financial powerhouse, right? Which is why he cannot be canceled. He can lose his Fox show, but he will still command millions of followers. And, the only good news there is if you're some 75-year-old MAGA guy who can, work a remote for your TV, you might have a little more difficulty signing up for Twitter and, being terminally online to follow Tucker's latest vitriol. But yeah, so it's a complicated scene here, but I just was on the phone with another friend of mine this morning about the changing nature of media. We're going through massive layoffs everywhere across the board. Storied news organizations are in slow motion or not so slow motion decline and fall. And, there's a really interesting interview with A.G. Sulzberger of the New York Times in the New Yorker magazine about all of this. And he's asked by David Remnick, what do you mean? You think that journalists are just staring at a computer screen and forced to churn out too much copy? I don't see that. He's like, absolutely, that's what I see. And that's the real problem. The death of local news leads to an attempt to cannibalize or aggregate that which has already been reported. And it's like, making a Xerox of a Xerox. It gets worse and worse and worse with multiple copies. Yeah. But talk about the lack of local news. Imagine if news organizations, and, the New York Times, as Sulzberger was boasting, had reporters and bureaus in Afghanistan and Iraq throughout both wars and then even after those wars. But imagine if news organizations had invested in Ukraine in 2014, right? After Crimea, after Donbass, the way that they've invested in other things. And imagine if there had been a real attempt to understand the evolving. I mean, I remember seeing New York Times. I mean, they're kind of glorified bloggers and now podcasters, but they were saying things like, well, you can divide Ukraine neatly along linguistic lines. They speak Russian here and they speak Ukrainian here. I said, have you ever been to fucking Kyiv? In 2014, you get off the plane, everything in the airport is in Russian. Everyone speaks to you in Russian. Everyone in Kyiv was speaking Russian. And frankly, they were speaking Russian up until about February 25th, 2022 in Kyiv. The return of Ukrainian language and as a matter of patriotism to use that instead of Russian is a very newfangled thing. And this is a country that's been at war for 10 years with Russia. So again, another data point, simple to see if you just go and visit the place that you purport to try and analyze and understand.
So,
I actually want somebody to get off their chair and go somewhere. You're very.
Look, it's hard for me. I'm not. I'm not a foreign correspondent in the conventional sense, right? I have a family. I have a wife and a young daughter. I live in New York. I can't go away for prolonged periods of time to. Not even. I'm not a very brave person, so I don't go to trenches. I don't go up to the contact line. I mostly talk to intelligence officers, military officials, and politicians in Kyiv when I go. But I have to go because I can't write about Ukraine without ever having been to Ukraine. So I make a point, and I end up. News organizations. Another thing is they don't have the budget, or they're not willing to part with the money to send reporters to these places, right? Which is why everything has become OSINT. I got news for you, though. An entire generation has sprung up around us who think that if they can't see it on their computer screen, on Twitter or Telegram or YouTube, it didn't happen. It's their entire sort of, epistemological way of processing information and understanding the way of the world. There is something deeply, deeply wrong and dangerous about that.
So it's gonna be worse, right? I was hoping we were going to.
Absolutely, it's going to be worse. And I'm all for. We have geolocated this Leopard tank to this settlement in Lugansk. Great, have at it. But don't be telling me that you're understanding the tick-tock of this conflict. It's hard enough as a real reporter. I think Thomas Ricks, who was Washington Post war correspondent and then the author of very good books about Iraq. He has a line where he says, understanding combat is relatively easy, but understanding war is fucking difficult, right? And again, I made a point, January 2022, I had one simple assignment to myself. How come no one in Ukraine seems to be panicking about what everyone in Washington and London was saying was inevitable, which is Putin's coming in and he's coming in hot. So I went to Kyiv, I spent a week. And my takeaway was nobody thought he'd be this stupid because everybody thought that Ukraine would not only put up a fight, but they would make Russia choke on this country, right? So you could say Ukraine was wrong, but for the right reasons. And in the American analytic journalistic community, I think we were right for the wrong reason. We knew the war was coming, or that was the tick-tock of the reporting. But this whole Kyiv wiped out in 3 days, don't even bother sending javelins. An insurgency, don't even train for that. It's going to be government in exile and that's it. Where's the reckoning for that? And by the way, this had an impact in terms of policymaking. Certain weapon systems were not sent in advance because the fear was you guys would not exist and these weapons would fall into Russian hands. And now where are we? More Patriot missile batteries headed to Kyiv, because you're intercepting everything that the Russians fire at you with them, including the quote-unquote invincible Kinzhal. Main battle tanks, now F-16s, eventually ATACMS. Again, to my point earlier about how things have changed so dramatically because Ukraine has forced them to. Very uncomfortably and inconveniently for a lot of people who staked entire reputations, not just in the United States, but in Europe. And the West. For
the last couple of weeks, we are increasingly feeling, especially with this Kakhovka Dam explosion made by Russians, obviously, we are feeling like we are losing this informational war against Russia, like the things which happened in 2014, 15, when we were like gaslighted and when the media just turned their backs on Ukraine. We feel that again, and I don't know how to explain this, but like, do you see that? Do you see that something changed in the last like couple of weeks, maybe month, and changed not in the Ukraine's favor in these terms?
I see what you mean, and I mean I'm at the moment writing an article on the Kakhovka Dam and saying, okay, we now are at a state in which we have enough hard documentary evidence and enough broader perspective and analysis that we can attribute, I think, pretty reasonably and plausibly this atrocity to Russia, right? When the New York Times says it's an explosion and then says, and then a disaster unfolded. Well, excuse me, like, read Orwell's Politics in the English Language. If you've concluded definitively it's an explosion, then who exploded it? Who was there? Who was capable? Who had the will, the intent, and who did not?
And the access to.
So we have to be, I think, I understand, nobody wants to get ahead of their skis and say, I'm calling it, because then it's very easy to embarrass yourself this way.
Yeah.
And, I've been having this conversation not just with my writing partner, James Rushton, who's in Kyiv at the moment, but also European security officials who say, we've talked to the Americans. We know the Americans know the Russians done it. And we're scratching our heads and actually pounding the table a little bit as to why it's taking so long for the United States to attribute. And I said, I think I know why. Oh, well, the day that the Kakhovka Dam was blown up by Russia, full stop, the Washington Post reported, based on Discord leaks, that, the CIA had advanced warning that Ukrainians, including perhaps Zaluzhny as the mastermind of this operation, was going to blow up Nord Stream pipeline. And I think the American intelligence community is now very, very afraid because, remember, there were anonymous quotes from U.S. intelligence officials after Nord Stream saying, well, it must have been Russia. Well, okay. And by the way, Ukrainians will disagree with me on this too, but I'm not under any illusions. I think Ukrainian actors did do this, right? And
you think so? Because we honestly don't know.
Yes, I know, but I mean, I do. And, by the way, I'm not, everyone's like, oh, we can't say that because look, okay, the Germans have more or less ruled out Russian culpability. Even if they've identified the Ukrainian actors who've done it, it still hasn't stopped German security assistance, nor has it stopped the Western coalition supporting Ukraine more generally and broadly, right? I think.
So you think they know already, despite all this?
They do. But again, look, this is a perfect example of what I meant earlier. Like journalists who try to get at the bottom of something and uncover facts, however inconvenient or sort of embarrassing to the side that you want to support, they're not doing something wrong. And in this case, I had this conversation with some British friends of mine who were digging into Nord Stream. And I said, okay, have at it. I said, if I could stand up the story, I would stand it up. Because they thought, oh, you don't want to report on this because you're afraid it's too much blowback to keep. I said, no, I would always report on it if I knew I had a good scoop on my hands. That's another thing you need to know about journalists. We're narcissistic, egomaniacal, and if it's the cause or us and our reputation and potential for professional success, I got news for you. It's usually going to be the latter. However, I also said, I don't think this is going to affect Ukraine. Too much time has gone by. The Germans said yes to sending Leos, not only directly, but indirectly through, the re-export license. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of people in the West would be like, Nord Stream, energy has always been a weapon of Russian military and foreign policy, right? Blowing up a pipeline that was already kind of a dead thing anyway because of the war is not going to be seen as something completely untoward, including to a lot of the Germans who are probably, the Greens are probably looking to bestow medals on whoever did this in Ukraine because they were ringed.
Listen, and this is an important part what you said, which I would like to stress here. It's absolutely fine to have opinions about anything, and it's obviously a journalist's job to report on, if it's Ukrainians or Russians or whatever. My issue and my concern comes with you can either report on saying allegedly Ukrainians have blown up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or you can say the Ukrainian neo-Nazi fascists blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. pipeline, which is usually, I'm obviously,
Yeah.
overplaying your
I haven't seen
but
anyone
that's the thing.
No, but it's hilarious.
It's just a comparison,
Another reason I give as an example as to why this story should come out. Look at how the Kremlin information operation has taken shape. They don't want to assign blame to Ukraine. They want to assign blame to the United States, right? Yeah. They have bear hugged the Cy Hirsch conspiracy theory, which has completely fallen apart like tissue paper. All of their agents of influence and their mouthpieces, particularly in the West, are doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down on the Cy Hirsch nonsense, including, we found a boot at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, which belongs to American divers. No, it's a thing you can fucking buy off Amazon. I mean, it's gotten to such absurd degrees to try and pin the blame on Biden and Washington that, to be honest, if the full story came out, it was, not necessarily the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian government, but perhaps, very well-to-do Ukrainian oligarch who has a reason and an opportunity to go rogue, who was responsible for this. Okay, well, what say you, Moscow? Well, they're going to say, well, no, it can't have been the Ukrainians. They don't have the agency or the capability to do something this bold and successful. It has to be the nefarious, main adversary. They've tied themselves up in so many knots. It doesn't matter at this point. So yeah, I mean, but I mentioned the Nord Stream thing is because I think that there's a great deal of reluctance and a great conservatism on the part of the American intelligence community. We don't want to definitively say one thing or the other because we could easily be embarrassed, right? And that's not a bad thing per se, but again. And I'm not even talking circumstantial evidence. I'm talking evidence. SBU intercepts. Gore published this
which sounds
audio,
sketchy, to be honest. But yeah.
Yes. Okay. Fine. Well, then you can discount that if you want. SBU intercepts, though, are not easily discounted because they were entered into evidence in the Dutch MH17 trial, right, which resulted in convictions of Russians. So, and just we have a Norwegian seismology firm locating a blast at 2:54 a.m., which is around the time that eyewitnesses reported hearing big explosions. The seismology firm says it was an explosion. You have two New York Times articles, right? One, structural engineers looked at the whole thing and concluded it must have been an explosion internally. This wasn't overtopping, is the term they use, or just a natural deterioration because of high water levels. And the second article, U.S. spy satellites detected an explosion from inside the dam. Well, okay, if an explosion inside the dam happened, who put the fucking explosives there? Ooh. How could Ukraine have done it? Paint me a picture. How did they do it? If you can give me a plausible scenario, then fine. Then we can leave this as an open-ended question. But now we have reached a point where it almost beggars belief that it was anybody but Russia that done it.
I have a theory. Maybe a little bit of conspiracy, but maybe, just maybe, American government don't want to publish the results of their the results of their investigation, not to react, because this they were talking about escalation a lot, and now Russia uses this as a weapon of mass destruction. It essentially was a mass destruction, and they did it, and there's zero accountability. No new sanctions against Russia, no reaction whatsoever from the West, and they just don't publish their intelligence. And that's it.
In terms of, they're not saying it because it's too catastrophic and it would lead to too many repercussions for Russia. That I disagree, and I'll explain why in a second. What I think maybe you're on to, and what I would agree with, is declassifying intelligence is a very agonized process. That's why all of the intelligence suggesting the Russians were preparing for a full-scale invasion was unprecedented in the history of
absolutely.
the US. Right. So, and the reason for it is when you declassify and you start to sort of name names or show what you know, it's not that difficult to figure out, meaning the enemy can figure out how you know it, right? So if you have human sources, even if you have signals intelligence capabilities, that can be rolled up very quickly. And sometimes, and quite often, in fact, in the annals of, just all intelligence, knowing a crime has been committed, it is worth more to say nothing or to even cover up that crime than to expose an elaborate, covert, and highly successful data collection mechanism. I mean, the Venona decrypts are the classic example. FBI and what was essentially became the NSA for the space of a few years in the 40s, intercepted almost all the traffic coming from Washington, D.C., meaning the Soviet embassy, and New York, so the Soviet consulate, back to Moscow. And they sometimes these transcripts, these transmissions contained the legal names, not even just the cryptonyms, the legal names of Soviet agents in America, meaning Americans, right? And the FBI didn't touch them, or they tried to get them on other things like, oh, you were an illegal immigrant, or you lied to us. Hint, hint, lying to the FBI, usually that's not what they're getting you on. It's called gray mailing. They're trying to get you at a lesser crime because they know that you're more dangerous at a higher level. But anyway, I think that, yeah, look, it's going to come out eventually. But in terms of what the American response thus far to these grievous atrocities has been, I disagree with you fundamentally, because you notice every time the Russians do something horrific, this terror campaign in the winter, hitting not just critical infrastructure, but killing civilians, babies, targeting schools, targeting hospitals, you name it, it led to you getting Patriot missile systems. It led to bolstering Ukraine's air defenses. And not to even attribute too much humanitarian imperative here, one of the reasons that happened, as was told to me by a European diplomat, is that a lot of, you got American officials and, guards of the embassy. You've got European diplomats all over Kyiv. So Russia is had the potential to kill foreign nationals in Ukraine's capital, and they simply could not allow that to take place. So again, if there is full attribution for Kakhovka Dam, you can expect either overtly or covertly the United States, in concert with its partners, sending more sophisticated and higher powered kit to Ukraine, because that's usually been the kind of trajectory of this thing.
So revenge is served cold. That's what you said.
You already got storm shadows. So everything is in target. Everyone wants ATACMS. Biden has suddenly said that's still on the table. Everybody I talk to says, yeah, all of the excuses, it's a red line for Putin. We have inventory problems. Ish, but not so bad that we couldn't supply Ukraine with them. So, and that's, by the way, coming from Republican congressmen and their staffers in Washington.
I have a question. So when United States decided to turn around in its F-16 position, aviation position, there were rumors by some people, I don't remember who already, not too trustworthy, that something changed between Biden and Jake Sullivan, and that Biden turned to some other side of the position on Ukraine and on escalation and all this stuff. How much is it true?
Yeah, you can do a kind of Kremlinology of the White House.
Yeah, exactly. That how it sounds. Yeah.
Look, I've said it publicly, and right as of now, do I know what's happening in Jake Sullivan's mind? No. Did I ever really know what's happening in his mind? No. But I have people in the administration who have said from the beginning, Sullivan was somebody who was far more reluctant to provide advanced weaponry to Ukraine. And I think part of it is a fear of Russian retaliation, which, if you're national security advisor, fair play. You have to be concerned about these things. Part of it, though, again, it's become somehow inconvenient or considered indecorous to attribute cynical motives to American policymakers and politicians, even though most journalists in days of yore only thought that way. But, Sullivan's grand design was just to make good on the old Obama strategic pivot to Asia, right? The 25-year doctrine to countermand Chinese hegemony and influence and, the rest of it. So Ukraine, I think, for him, from day one, was a big distraction and something that he didn't anticipate having to deal with, or much less into his legacy. However, I think that, things have evolved sufficiently. People who were sort of naysayers on things, Colin Kahl, who is, what's the title, Undersecretary for Policy at the Defense Department. He was somebody who didn't want to give F-16s. He's the guy who gave the official line at the Pentagon, which when he was testifying before Congress, he said, well, it will take 18 months to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, and then also 18 months to deliver the F-16s. Well, I can't speak to delivery, but James Rushton and I published a U.S. Air Force assessment where they took 3 Ukrainian pilots. I think 2 of them were MiG-29 pilots. One was a Sukhoi-27 pilot.
Super, yeah.
And they brought them to, an air base in the United States and put them in the simulator and found, lo and behold, they're doing advanced maneuvers for the first time in the simulator and doing it not just competently, but very well. And their estimate was 4 months. So dramatically shorter time frame to train up Ukrainian pilots, which raises all kinds of interesting questions, such as, well, if you had put them through the simulator like a year ago or even 6 months ago, by now they'd be F-16 pilots, right? So, again, we don't like to, it's people who feel reflexively defensive of the Biden administration, not just necessarily because they agree with everything they're doing with respect to Ukraine, but they don't want to give this Republican Party any ammunition whatsoever, given who's the front runner for the presidency. They have a hard time reckoning with contradictory or, shall we say, less than satisfying bits of information that don't fit the narrative. But look, we reported our story. I think a day later, they announced, hey, we're going to be training up Ukrainians on F-16s. And, okay, it'll only take 4 months now. Great. That's progress. So happy to be of service as a journalist to,
thank you.
Prevailing. But, I've also heard one thing that I think speaks well to the president. I don't know about his little team of wise men and, who's advising whom at what point, but is he's presented with these contingency plans. He's presented with options. He's told, here's why we shouldn't. And then eventually he's like, no, fuck it. I think we should.
I was going to say, this is always like that. We talked about this before.
We forgot.
And,
we also forget.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have cottoned on to this. And I forget who it was who was quoted saying, we stopped paying attention to, sorry, can't do, shouldn't do, because we know that eventually the Americans will. And that's been, a tested proposition in the last 16 months.
Yeah, so. The only thing I would like to add, I think I'm not wrong, but we're forgetting to give Biden some agency, because he's kind of capable of doing things, and he's the decision maker, and
well, also he cares.
Yeah, and he cares.
That's the most important thing. He genuinely, Biden on the Middle East. Whoa, don't get me started. That's a whole other kit and caboodle. And again, I spent 10 years doing Syria when he was vice president, and he was in charge of Iraq at that point under Obama's administration. And you can have me on a separate program to discuss all of that. But Biden on Europe is Democratic John McCain, essentially. He genuinely believes in this Europe whole and free project that began in '89. And, these are the virtues of having a guy who's, shall we say, a little long in the tooth and getting up in years.
He's been in Ukraine.
He remembers the Cold War, you see politicians who sort of get elected and they were born after the Berlin Wall came down or just slightly before, and they don't remember a period when, what Moscow was doing was truly horrific and totalitarian. And they think that all of that's in the past, and anyone banging on about it is, some kind of neocon, warmonger, American imperialist, blah, blah, blah. And, again, to his credit, Joe Biden, pretty liberal Democrat, but genuinely believes in Ukraine's not only survival, but its prosperity. So that's important.
And you kind of came to one of the last questions I have, and it sort of has to do with the thing we spoke at the beginning of our conversation, is that, you said liberal John McCain, and absolutely, but how is it, and why is
Democratic
it...
John McCain.
Democratic John McCain. How is it that the Republican Party was the one most prone to Russian propaganda and to Russian narratives? How did it happen in the scope of these 30 years that somehow the people we should have relied on most to be, skeptical and cynical and wary of Russians And then obviously not talking about all of them. I mean, some of them have been doing their job very well, but especially the MAGA fringe, that part of the party. How did it come to be? Because I was obviously expecting something like this. I mean, maybe 10 years ago, if you asked me, I would have never thought that we would have to actually work more with the Republicans in terms of explaining things than with the Democrats.
I think it's been a very long, winding process. I lived in the UK for 3 years, almost 3 years, from I think around 2010 to late 2012. And what I noticed, to my surprise at the time, but in hindsight it almost looks quaint, was the Russian government, its quote-unquote diplomats, really SVR officers in the embassy, were expending a lot of energy and resources trying to cultivate members of the Conservative Party in the UK. And not just parliamentarians, but also young party activists, people who were on the make and who in 10 years' time, 20 years' time could very well be MPs, or if not, in Downing Street. And I tried to figure out, what is going on here? For instance, at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, United Russia voted in the same bloc as the Conservative Party of the UK. Very strange. And this was coming on, after Litvinenko's assassination, after innumerable stories about Russian money laundering through Londongrad phenomenon, Russian oligarchs buying up houses and homes, all of this stuff. And, one of the things that you can compartmentalize a little bit. So one, never discount rank opportunism. I remember there was this lobby group, the Conservative Friends of Russia, rebranded as the Westminster Russia Forum. And they were all like very awkward. They look like a bunch of like weird socially inept incels, but ones who were promised Gazprom consultancy contracts and very pretty Russian girls when they traveled to Moscow. And indeed, I think a lot of them were compromised at strip clubs and all the rest of it. This has come out in a documentary. So, okay, that's one thing. Another thing, though, is if you are ideological and reactionary in your ideology, you like blood and soil nationalism. You don't like the idea of the European Union. It's bureaucracy run amok as a transnational phenomenon. You don't like gays, or now LGBTQ. You think that you pine for some nostalgic never was, whether it's the 1950s or in some cases, certainly to judge by the attire worn by a lot of these weird eccentric conservatives in the UK, the 19th century. You long for the age of British Empire, and that was the sort of glorious tradition. There's a lot that the Russians can sell you, right?
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Very much.
Thank you very much for being with us.